There are a number of moral arguments for God's existence. The first one we'll look at comes from Immanuel Kant, a famous 18th century philosopher, whose first premise is that moral behavior is rational. People don't just do things they ought to do for no reason, they have a reason for doing them. Secondly, this is only a good reason, it's only rational if justice will be done eventually. Something like the afterlife. After all, we don't see justice being done here and now all the time. People who get away with murder or will get justice eventually, but only if God exists. Only if there is an all-knowing, perfect judge who sees everything done in secret. Thus, God must exist. This argument is affirmed by the famous Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, author of Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov. He has his character Ivan say something along the lines of, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Dostoevsky saw many of his colleagues, many of his friends going toward atheism, and he was very concerned of the moral fabric of his country, because if God doesn't exist, what reason do we have to be moral? Another moral argument is that of C.S. Lewis, the formal moral argument. He starts by looking around, seeing that there is a universal sense of ought. I ought to rescue a drowning person. I ought to obey my parents. This implies a command or a law, something that doesn't just come from my parents. My parents got it from somewhere. There must have been someone to give this originally, some lawgiver, God. One objection to the moral argument is that of cultural relativism, or moral relativism. It argues that, look, we look at all these different cultures and we don't see a universal moral code. We see a whole lot of different morals. Take, for example, the practice of killing babies. We see some cultures where this is horrid. We see other cultures where it is becoming permissible. We've seen this in the ancient cultures like the Canaanites, Romans even, the Eskimos killing their firstborn if it's not a boy. These were acceptable practices in those cultures. However, if you're going to defend the moral argument, you're going to counter that by saying that, look, really it's the beliefs that are different in these cultures. Eskimos believed that the only way to survive was if they had a firstborn son. Take the Canaanites and the Mayans. They made human sacrifices because they believed that their God required it for survival. Witches were put to death in England hundreds of years ago, not because the country was less moral, but because they believed in witches. They believed in people connected to Satan doing harm to others. Take another example of moral relativism, that is of theft. You know, we all think that stealing is wrong, right? In every culture? Well, take a look at the culture of the Marshall Islands. There are many Marshall Islands, of course, and one of them has a peculiar tradition where if you have your little hut and someone wants to borrow your shovel, they just come in and take your shovel when you're gone. You come back, your shovel's gone. Sounds like stealing. Sounds like in the Marshall Islands, theft is okay. Moral, cultural relativism. Well, that's not exactly the case. In this particular culture, they're okay as a community with borrowing. In fact, borrowing isn't even the right word. It's sharing. It's all communal. The shovel actually belongs to the community. It's a communal shovel. Now, there would be stealing, there would be theft in this culture if you took a shovel and you refused to give it to someone, or you took a shovel and you buried the shovel under your bed. That would be theft. And so another response to this objection is that many of the differences among cultures are merely customary, sometimes based on beliefs, such as private property versus communal living, other times merely preferences, such as the left side of the street versus the right. And so the argument goes that the first premise, that there's a universal sense of right and wrong, still stands. Another objection is that, well, in general, we have similar morals, but that came about because we all evolved from primates and so forth, through a natural process of eliminating species or groups that did not have good morals. And so it's the cooperative species that pass on their traits. So if you got a tribe of chimps, they comb each other's hair, pick each other's lice, listen to their leaders when they're going into battle against other chimp tribes. Those are the cooperative groups. Those are the ones that'll live, and so they're the ones that are going to pass on their morality to the next generation. However, if we're really going to say that ethics come about through natural selection, this leads to what is generally frowned upon in the world of ethics, and that is Darwinian ethics, the survival of the fittest. So, in the workplace, survival of the fittest. From nation to nation, well, whoever's the fitter nation wins out. And so, if you aren't physically fit or mentally fit, we're going to weed you out. Darwinian ethics has led to all kinds of heinous things. I mean, Hitler was inspired by Darwin's Origin of the Species, keeping people who are fit and well shaped, of the right race, etc. And so this led to eugenics in Germany, the forced elimination of bad genes. And in the United States, it was encouraged, in some cases coerced, people with genetic defects forced not to have children. Darwinian ethics also inspired Hitler to go to war.
They must remain silent until they close in on their rivals. The attack is on. To intimidate their opponents, the aggressors scream and drum on buttress roots. The battle won, a grisly scene unfolds. An enemy youngster has been caught and killed. The carcass is shared between members of the group and eaten.
Such scenes do not lead us to just war theory, but rather to war for the purpose of domination. The Christian counter-argument here then is that we do not see moral improvement based on natural selection. We see the animal kingdom is under the same curse as human beings. And even Richard Dawkins can be used to support this claim. He says that a human society based simply on the genes law of universal ruthless selfishness would be a very nasty society in which to live. But unfortunately, however much we may deplore something, it does not stop it being true. Be warned, if you wish, as I do, to build a society in which individuals cooperate generously and unselfishly toward a common good. You can expect little help from biological nature. Let's try to teach generosity and altruism, because we're born selfish. Richard Dawkins contradicts this argument in saying that, look, genetics doesn't really give us altruistic behavior, selfless behavior. Well, where does it come from? Does it come from an atheist? No. It comes from religion. It comes from religions that teach selfless living. And so we again affirm the second premise is that the sense of ought implies there has been some command or law given. Thus, there must be a universal lawgiver, that is God.